From the Westmead Highway, you follow the distant screams and smoke that hangs in the cool night air. After a few moments, the dry dirt trail bends and reveals an orange glow in the distance. The captain of the guard traveling with you stops, only for a moment in shock. "By Berdine. Gray Hearth, she burns!" He quickly dashes along the path, but soon stops again as you all near the outer wall of the village. The stone walls flanking the entry road have been heavily damaged. The smoke is thick as the fields to your right burn brightly in the night. Now you hear the noise that stopped the captain in his advance. A distant storage shed suddenly ignites, and two dog-like creatures are revealed. "Knowles!" Captain growls, before charging forward. Now if you please, roll for initiative. For this rough wood fence project, you're going to want to get your hands on some coffee stir sticks, some popsicle sticks, and some matchsticks that are about 2.5 inches long. Using a sharp-bladed instrument, you'll want to score the matchstick in about 1-inch increments. You don't need to cut all the way through the matchstick. Simply scoring it and breaking it apart by hand is the safer approach if you're not comfortable in handling a blade. If you find that the wood feathers a little bit after you break it apart, you can rub the feathered end against your mat or any other hard surface to flatten it back out. These 1-inch matchsticks are going to represent a fence that is about 5 feet tall on a scale D&D map. We then take a popsicle stick, and using the ruler on the mat, we'll place 3 marks that are nearly equidistant to serve as guides to attach the matchsticks. In this case, I'm spacing the marks 2 inches apart to represent a fence that will have an overall length of nearly 20 feet. Now take one of the wooden coffee stir sticks and firmly press down on one end. Now very carefully take your sharpest razor or box cutter and cut down the middle of the stick away from your fingers. The sharpness of a blade is very important in cases like this. The duller the blade, the more force is required to make the cut, and force is your enemy when one hand is holding something slicey. And like the matchsticks, you don't need to cut the stir stick all the way through to the cutting mat. You can pry the pieces apart with your fingers, which will help the overall texture of the piece when we're adding some washes later. Don't worry about making perfect cuts either. Once comfortable with my technique, I purposefully gave my knife hand subtle twists to simulate a hand-hewn plank. Just take it slow. After completing your cuts, lay the pieces out on a piece of paper or cardboard you don't really care about getting messy, and apply some color. Here I'm using a homemade brown wash, but since this is real wood we're working with, you could use just about anything you want, even wood stain that you find in your local hardware store's paint aisle. Just keep in mind to use gloves if you're not using something that's water-based, as it can easily stain your hands. Give everything a generous coating, and don't worry about making the pieces too wet. A little hydration will actually help prevent the pieces like the stir sticks from breaking later when bending during assembly. When the pieces are no longer sticky, it's time to fire up your hot glue gun and begin assembly. Instead of picking up my hot glue gun and using it like a normal person, I always opt to leave mine sitting on the table and use a finger's pressure on the glue stick to extrude just enough onto my working piece. Give the piece a nice glob of glue on the end. If there's too much, you can always trim it later. Don't worry too much about keeping the posts perfectly vertical either. These fences are meant to represent fences in the real world that are put up and torn down regularly when the need arises. Perfect pieces always tend to look less authentic in my eyes. With the posts done, we can now begin weaving the slats between them. Take a split stir stick and give it a slight bend, and insert it between the posts like this. With the next piece, bend it the opposite way of the first and insert it on top of the first one. Continue alternating bends with each piece until you reach a height that you're comfortable with. We're not gluing these pieces in place, so don't be afraid to disassemble and reassemble until they stack together in a way that looks good to you. Now that the general assembly is complete, I decided I wanted to trim the ends a bit to make it a little easier for the fence segments to fit together. Instead of cutting both ends, I opted to push the slats to one end, and then using a pair of scissors, cut the slats to length on the other end. To serve as a base for our block walls, I'm going to use just a bit of pizza box I've recycled from the bin, but just about anything cardboard or MDF would do just fine. Use the natural lines of the cardboard as a guide to draw yourself a 3" by 3" square, or more if you're making more of these in bulk. Here I'm making 2 at once. Cut your pieces using a sharp blade. Again, a sharp blade and even pressure are very important here. Collect the blocks you're planning to use, and if you're using foam, take this moment to give them a little bit of texture using a ball of foil. There are so many techniques for creating these bricks. Click the annotation for one of my favorites. Here I've made mine out of pink foam that you can get in 2" by 2" pieces at the hardware store for a few dollars. I then texture them in an old cat treat container with some random stone-like things that I have laying around my house by shaking the container. If this is your first build, you'll want to dry stack your blocks on the cardboard to get a sense for how you want the wall layout to look. Once satisfied with your layout, you can always take a picture to reference once we start hot gluing the pieces together. Don't be too concerned about the pieces not fitting together perfectly, or if your blocks are not uniform. This is an ancient stone wall for a village whose concern lies with crop failure and mead production rather than encroaching threats. But before gluing the pieces to the board, we'll give the base a coat in matte brown paint. Any dollar store or Walmart variety will do just fine here. Just wet your brush before loading your paintbrush and give it a good thinning for easier application. And don't worry about this paint job too much, as the purpose of this base coat is to camouflage the cardboard and will mostly be covered by flocking later. The nice thing about these cheap craft paints is the rate at which they seem to dry, or at least become workable. When the bases are no longer tacky to the touch, we can begin the process of replicating what we did when we dry stacked the wall. Using my finger to manually press down on the glue stick, I extrude just enough hot glue to the bottom of my working piece of the brick. You don't want to overdo it on the hot glue here, as we'll be pressing the bricks onto a firmer surface, and you may end up with glue showing in the seams. When working with foam, it's possible for your hot glue to melt into the foam. If you have variable temperature on your hot glue gun, feel free to turn it down a notch. If not, simply give the glue a few seconds on the nozzle to cool slightly before collecting it with the foam brick. At any point during the build, feel free to give your bricks a bit of character, even after they've been placed. Here I'm shortening one of the bricks on the end to give room for another brick. Simply use a razor blade or X-Acto knife to trim the end, then using a rolled up piece of foil, reapply your stone texture by gently rolling. The height of your wall is completely up to you. I'm building these pieces with 2 heights in mind for D&D encounters. The area that is 3 blocks tall will provide 3/4 cover, and 2 blocks will provide half cover to player characters and enemies alike. Here I'm using my blade to cut a brick in half, but I'm not trying for a straight cut. As you cut down, stop, and give the blade a slight twist, then continue cutting. You can continue giving the piece character by taking little chips out of the block with the tip of the blade. Dig in just a millimeter, and then kick the tip of the blade out of the block. This will tear the foam and give it a less intentional look. When making any kind of piece that exists in your world, embrace the chaos and mistakes during crafting. These structures are made by men, not gods or machines. Remember to retexture any pieces you've cut with a roll of foil, but don't overdo it on the pieces you've given a lot of character to, as it can distract the eye once washes are applied. Now we move on to applying a primer coat to our piece. Here I'm using a mixture of black craft paint and matte Mod Podge. Instead of pretending this is something I've dreamt up, I've placed an annotation of Black Magic Craft's video on making this indispensable concoction. Let the Mod Podge completely dry before applying your first layer of paint, as a wet brush could reactivate some of the glue in the Mod Podge and muddy your paint. Here I'm using a Folk Art medium gray and a wet brush technique. Don't be afraid to go back and reapply your base coat of gray until you get the coverage you're looking for. Once that dried, I applied a dry brushing of Folk Art Steel Gray. I chose a dry brush with shorter, more flexible bristles and was a little firmer with my motions. I decided to lighten the piece a bit further by dry brushing with the titanium white. This time I chose a dry brush with longer, stiffer bristles and was very light with my technique, as we're just looking to highlight here. Now we move on to the wash. I'm using a homemade black wash here to apply generous amounts to the piece, and if you turn the tile as you apply the wash, it helps it to flow around the nearby surfaces and get into the spaces between the bricks. Give the piece a few minutes to rest once you've applied the wash, then go back and dab at it with a paper towel. This will help pull up any of the ponding wash that occurs from such a liberal application. After the wash is dried, I use some dollar store white glue to coat the bottom of the tile, and then spread it around with a cheap brush. Don't worry about getting glue on the bricks where they connect to the tile too much, as it'll help the flocking stick to the brick as well, and give them the appearance of having fallen into a lush patch of grass. Lay the tile on a piece of paper and use any flocking you like to coat the cardboard. You can be generous here. Use the end of a brush to press the flocking down slightly to help with adhesion. Once you're satisfied with the coverage, turn the piece on its end and give it some gentle taps. This will allow any of the loose flock to fall back down onto the paper. You can then use the paper as a funnel to put the unused flocking back into the container. Though we've glued it from the tile, the flocking could still easily come away if touched, so on recommendation from the terrain building community on Reddit, I've mixed up a spritz bottle containing water and Mod Podge in a 50-50 ratio. Shake before use and coat the entire piece. Use a paper towel to draw up any areas where ponding occurs. Remember, don't rub, just dab, as rubbing could smear any paints reactivated by the water in the mix. For this shed build, I started with a simple design. I wanted the piece to fit on a single tile, but not consume the whole tile space, so I started with a 2" by 3" layout. I took round wooden sticks that can be purchased from your local craft store and placed a mark at 2.5 inches for the 3 center support posts and 2 inches for the 6 outer support posts. Once all my pieces were marked, I scored the lines with my blade and snapped the sticks with my fingers. This is a much safer approach than trying to cut through it with the knife. I cut a piece of thin cardboard from a frozen breakfast sandwich box to fit my 2-inch by 3-inch structure and hot glued the vertical support post to it. To provide extra support, I cut wooden coffee stir sticks to 3 inches and glued the tops of the post to it. I found that gluing the top support to the post first and then attaching it to the cardboard as one piece much easier than working with each post individually. With the vertical supports finished, I cut another stir stick to 2 inches and glued it across the middle post of each of the 3 support structures. I then cut 2 more 3-inch sections of stir stick, and then attached them to the bottoms of the outer support posts. These will serve as connection points for the bottoms of the wall post when we lay them in place. If you find yourself leaving too much hot glue behind after connecting pieces together, use a scrap piece of wood and either remove the extra or spread it out before it sets up completely. Squeeze some glue onto the tops and bottoms of the outer wall stir sticks, and if you need to, spread it evenly with a scrap piece of wood or your fingers. I've opted to use some tacky glue here that you can find in any dollar store these days. Don't be afraid to work in sections. This glue, while better than standard craft glue, still takes some time to set up properly. When done, lay your 2-inch round sticks down onto the glue and give them a slight press down. Keep laying down pieces until you have 2 complete outer walls. At this time, I chose to go ahead and give my cardboard bottom a basic coating of brown paint. Don't worry too much about it getting on the wood pieces at the bottom. We'll be applying a layer of flocking later that will cover up any painting mistakes here. Don't forget to give the exposed cardboard on the outside of the structure a shot of paint as well. We're not looking for full coverage here, but more like a layer of camouflage. Now we hit the rest of the exposed wood with a layer of territorial beige. I gave this paint a good thinning with water and used a wet brush to apply this coat. Since the wood is so uniform on these hobby store sticks, a little variation in the quality of the paint job will be accentuated by the wash we apply later, giving the piece a better look. Now you can totally do all this painting well in advance of assembly, and if I did this all over again, I probably would. But as I'm building this piece on the fly and learning as I go, I think it best to share my journey, including the mistakes and the lessons learned. Once the paint is dry, brush a coat of glue or Mod Podge onto the base and set the entire thing on a piece of scrap paper. Then take whatever flocking or terrain simulation you prefer and sprinkle it onto the glue. Here I chose a brown ballast that I wanted to simulate rough, dry earth. When my glue had time to set up, I decided to add another layer of flocking for some color and variation. I used a 50-50 mix of water and Mod Podge in a spritz bottle and gave the ballast a good coating. It was then that I realized I wanted to add some flocking to the outside too, so I cut another piece of the same cardboard to the standard 3" by 3" tile size and glued it to the bottom. I chose to add some of this dry orange flock to the top of the ballast to give it a look as if some old hay was left intermingled with the ground. I also added some touches of green grass flocking to the edges for effect, and then hit the whole interior base with another coating from the Mod Podge spritzer. Then brush on some glue to the extra cardboard on the sides and sprinkle the same green grass flocking. Use a stir stick to press evenly to get the flocking to stick. Then hit the whole thing with another spritz. I'd recommend letting this dry before moving on to the wash, as some of the residual overspray from the Mod Podge could affect your wash if it's still wet. I then gave all the wood a generous coat of brown wash and set it aside to dry. I wanted a removable roof on this piece, so I could hide minis and other set pieces inside easily. So I cut off another piece of this cardboard and gave it a fold down the middle. Careful measurement isn't required here, as the more rustic and cobbled together this thing looks, the better. Fold, test fit, cut and fold some more until you're satisfied with the way the roof sits on the walls, and then give the underside a good coat of Black Magic Crafts Mod Podge mix. When dry, glue some stir sticks onto the edges and just cut them to size. If you find your piece isn't holding its shape properly at this stage, use hot glue to help retain the shape as you place the stir sticks together. Again, precision isn't required here. Just roughly measure, then trim a little. Test fit, and trim again until it sits just right before you try gluing it on. A note about this craft: if you're new to using hot glue in small pieces, a stir stick between your fingers could easily roll and suddenly you find your fingertips in hot glue. It's something you get used to after doing it for a while, but just be cautious. If you're worried about that happening to you, you can put a little bit of medical tape around your fingertips to protect you until you're more comfortable. When you're done, coat the top with some white craft glue and give it a nice thin coat of ballast. Then hit the ballast with a coat of Mod Podge spritz and pack on some green flock. When you're all done, hit the flocking with some Mod Podge spritz to seal, and enjoy. With the sing of steel in the night air, the last of the Null pair falls to the dust with a deep thud. You all stop to look at the captain, expecting him to say something, give an order, anything. But he's not there anymore. He's already begun dashing as quick as his dwarvish legs would carry him towards the town proper. The roar of burning fields is deafening, flames so bright all around you. But somehow, in the air, you can still hear the screams of villagers and the barks of more gnolls. Now I ask of you all, what would you like to do?